So I think just about everyone here either knows me and knows the conference or was here last night, so I'm not going to do a long introduction, but for the one or two of you who may not know why I'm standing up here, my name is John Hopkins. I'm a member of the faculty here at NYU, and it has been my real pleasure to organize this conference over the last year. So before I say another word, I want to thank once again Matthew Santarocco and Anna Donch, who is over here, the coordinator for the Center for Ancient Studies. I want to thank ISAW, the IFA, the Remark Institute, and the Archaeology Hub, Hannah Lachlan and Claire Davis. Without that whole cluster of support, this would not be happening. So it is now my pleasure to welcome you all to this day of exciting talks that I have really been looking forward to for a year. I'm going to get myself out of the way as quickly as possible so that we can move on to the reason why you're all here. I do just want to talk about a couple of logistics for the day so that everybody understands the order of business. And then I'm just going to give you a sense of what the run of the talks will look like. Just for the logistics, after a few minutes up here, I will pass the microphone to Lara Sánchez-Morales, who will chair the first session. And as you see, the first session is a little bit on the slightly longer side. The other two sessions are about an hour and a half. The first session is about 2 hours and 15 minutes. 3 talks in that 2 hours and 15 minutes. What we've asked the speakers to do is stick to about 25 to 35 minutes, which will give us time for questions immediately after each talk. Then we'll break for lunch, and then we'll move on to the second session in the afternoon. Coffee, nice little pause there, because as Donnell reminded us last night, leisure is not only a privilege, it is essential so that we can continue to have big thoughts. All right, and then all of this will be followed by discussion. So the first session of the day sets us off immediately with the fluidity and the sort of expansive thinking that we had in last night's conversation, or at least that conversation demanded of us, with 3 papers that will deal with dense kinds of information that in one speaker's world characterizes never-ending motion. I'm looking at you, Lara. Entangling narratives of human natural engagement with micro-specific analysis of social practices across 3 continents. Our speakers will explore vast geographical connectivity in crop cultivation and its applied use, in hierarchical imperial networks, and in how we understand invention. Small topic. A big view is essential. Connective lifeways are the key to this first session as we leap across 2,000 years from the late Bronze Age to the early 2nd millennium CE, hitting up against a point Joe made last night about the limitedness of limiting ourselves to the ancient. So 2 are ways of seeing that militate against juxtapositional views of ancient life. That is also a key feature here. And yet difference in practice is made essential by the speakers. Our speakers hold all of these qualities in tension as they set the stage. Then we will move on to session 2 after lunch. The first session ends with craft production by way of a highly conceptual and deeply materially grounded investigation of invention, as I mentioned. Our second session harnesses this craft focus as a means to investigate knowledge exchange and meaning adjustment. Staying with scientific analysis, which will be key features of the last talk of the first session, the first talk of the second session. Staying with scientific analysis of material remains, we continue our journey across 2 continents in this session, this time hopping from one site to another to explore illuminating differences in how craft wisdom and its products moved and fostered creative production on differing scales of geography and community. We equally witness how sacred materials from built environments, We equally witness how sacred materials, from built environments to precious gifts, often carry forms and technologies across perceived cultural lines. As with crop movement, though, we find that exchange and entanglement often generate a simultaneous presence and entropy of material use, creative wisdom, and object meaning. The third session explores the dark side of the interaction of vibrant matter and violent, exploitative, and appropriative human engagements, and it demands that we keep one eye on the uncomfortable and the painful features of history and of our own modern antagonisms. We will see how words often applied to the Roman situation, like conquest, empire, expansion, victory, syncretism, blending, incorporation, all of these have dark sides in occupation, taking, dehumanization, violence, predation, epistemicide, appropriation, and so on. We will see how these senses of imperial ownership carry into modern fights between urban and rural, Western and anti-Western civilizational thinking, the erasure of many actors central to this work, and the claim to Roman greatness. These are, of course, issues that affect both how the ancient world was and how we select and order our assemblage of it. If the first two panels present expansive views, these last two papers remind us of Troyo's insistence that in recovering and recentering silences in history, we also keep in view the selections that created silences. So we return to some of the conversation from last night. We will see across the 7 talks precisely the problems of disciplinary segregation, departmental structures, and the scale of resource needed to fill out wider views. We will see the need for bold, unflinching change in our universities and our ways of thinking. And we will see a need to be dynamic and flexible. Of course, despite the breadth and complex entanglements in these talks, they will only cover a tiny fraction of global possibilities, but they provoke discussion far beyond the geotemporal confines of their material. And each of our discussants brings views that expand how we can imagine them, and that was quite intentional. So, after the third panel, they, the discussants, who are also the chairs of each session, will offer some brilliant explorative remarks, no pressure, and set our final discussion of the day, one that I hope will spark ideas for additional ways of seeing and contributions to a volume that will emerge from these proceedings. Our panel chairs will each introduce speakers. I'd like to take just a moment to introduce them, the panel chairs, very briefly. Lara Sánchez-Morales is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at NYU. Her work focuses on the study of anthropogenic landscapes and what these can tell us about adaptive responses to climate, environmental, and socio-political changes over time. At NYU, she directs the Human Landscapes Lab, which integrates a suite of geochemical, geophysical, and microbotanical techniques used to reconstruct geomorphology, hydrology, and paleovegetation at various spatial temporal scales. Her geographic focus has been the Circum-Caribbean, with principal work to date on pre-colonial and historic sites in Puerto Rico, the effects of Holocene climate change on sedimentary archives, and a post-classic Mayan site in northwestern Belize. Subhashini Kaligotla is an art historian of ancient and medieval South Asia. Her areas of expertise extend from the architecture of the early centuries BCE into the first millennium CE. Her specific research interests include sacred spaces, Brahmanical, Buddhist, and Jaina, the agency of makers, materials, and objects in spaces, the dialogue between visual and textual representation and historiography. She's author of Shiva's Waterfront Temples, Architects and Their Audiences in Medieval India, published by Yale University Press in 2022. And this is a work that places the ingenuity of medieval Deccan Indian makers at its center. Greg Wolf is director of ISAW and professor of Mediterranean Studies here at NYU. His work focuses on the archaeology and history of the Roman Empire and the Mediterranean world more widely. He's published on literacy, on ancient knowledge cultures and libraries, on the Roman economy, on ancient religion, on the European Iron Age, and on questions of resilience and environmental history. His latest book, The Life and Death of Ancient Cities, A Natural History, his latest book is The Life and Death of Ancient Cities, A Natural History, and he is currently working on a series of publications on mobility in the ancient world, a subject he spoke on in this room just a few weeks ago. So, with that, thank you all for being here, and I will pass the podium to Lara Sánchez-Morales to get us started.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you, John, for having me here. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Suresh Muthukumaran. He's an ancient historian at the National University of Singapore. He won the American Historical Association's 2024 Jerry Bentley Prize in World History for his 2023 book, The Tropical Turn: Agricultural Innovation in the Ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean, published by the University of California Press. Along with Dr. Sushma Jansari, curator of South Asia at the British Museum. He is the co-author of the forthcoming British Museum exhibition book, Ancient India, Living Traditions. And he will be talking to us about crop cultures in Convergence, creating a unified contact zone in ancient Afro-Eurasia.
Thank you, Lara, for the introduction, and thank you, John, for inviting me. Also thank you to Anna, Claire, and Hannah for facilitating my visit. Okay, so let's get started. So in 326 BCE, when Alexander III of Macedon, the Great, sighted sacred lotuses in the Acacenes, or the modern Chenab River of northwestern India, he thought he had found the headwaters of the Nile. Such an idea was facilitated in the first place by a geographical notion that held that the same river, passing through a great southern desert, connected Egypt and India. Secondly, in the worldview of Greek speakers, the sacred lotus was distinctively associated with Egypt, and in Greek, toponymously styled the Egyptian bean, Aegyptios quamos. Yet the sacred lotus, whose modern scientific name is Nelumbo nucifera, was not a native of Egypt, but a species introduced by humans to Egypt from tropical Asia no earlier than 3 centuries prior. With large peltate leaves and showy pink or white flowers rising above the surface of the water, the sacred lotus was an ornamental plant par excellence. But in Egypt and elsewhere, it was also an important food crop, both the nutlets from its seed pod and its rhizome being edible. Alexander, who took to writing a letter to report his discovery to his mother Olympias, soon realized that his notions of geography were unfounded, for the rivers of northwestern India emptied instead into a vast ocean. Yet the world that Alexander was born into was coalescing, not geographically, but materially. The produce of distant lands circulated through a variety of networks, commercial, diplomatic, or otherwise, that crisscrossed the maritime and terrestrial lanes of Afro-Eurasia. The development of empires such as that of Alexander's and those of his Persian, Babylonian, and Assyrian precursors increasingly allowed for the security of long-distance movements on a scale hitherto uncommon or unrealized. With traveling humans came plants and animals from their native regions. At the outset, consumers were often introduced to economically useful plants in the form of foodstuffs, textiles, or finished products. Some of these acquaintances of new floral materials were probably unplanned or accidental, arising, for example, from the barter of foodstuffs and personal belongings following the completion of a journey. Apart from merchants, a range of other mobile peoples, including slaves, deportees, refugees, soldiers, messengers, diplomats, bureaucrats, colonists, porters, road surveyors, guides, craftsmen, and professionals, like physicians and cooks, were crucial in enabling the movement of plant products. In time, the plants themselves or their seeds were conveyed to distant lands, where they took root and flowered under a foreign sun. Their uses were diverse. Some produced edible grain and fruit, others yielded fibers or timber for clothing and construction. In this way, distant landscapes across Eurasia, Afro-Eurasia, were enmeshed, and their material cultures began to resemble each other, or at the very least shared elements in common by the end of the first millennium BCE. Such was the case of the sacred lotuses observed by Alexander, which grew both in the Nile and in the vast rivers of India. Yet botanical translocations were neither linear processes nor uniform in their impact. Certain crops spread through a single decisive introduction, while others require repeated encounters and varied migratory paths. Transcontinental connectivity was not a given. The ebb and flow of human movements and the movement of crops depended on a range of factors, including confidence in travel and economic opportunism. Some crops became transformative forces in history, spreading rapidly and enduringly, while others remained regionally confined. Still others, including the sacred lotus, gained temporary traction, but ultimately proved to be fleeting phenomena across parts of their introduced range. Transplanted crops were also used and interpreted in ways that were unfamiliar in their place of origin. Almost everywhere, they were adapted to fit local traditions, needs, and cultural frameworks, or in modern terms, they were globalized. Beginning some 10,000 years ago, a range of crops were domesticated in multiple regions of Afro-Eurasia. Post-domestication, human-led crop migrations were multi-directional and episodic processes that brought together previously isolated crop cultures. These entailed the spread of a great variety of crops that yielded grains, pulses, nuts, tubers, fruits, vegetables, fiber, oil, aromatics, and spices. Some plants had ornamental uses and were also the source of medicines, narcotics, poisons, beverages, condiments, dyes, perfumes, cosmetics, fodder, and raw materials for construction. These functions were not mutually exclusive, and the same plant and its constituent parts often had multiple applications, both calorific and non-calorific. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, East Asian millets like broomcorn millet and foxtail millet were transmitted to Europe along the Inner Asian mountain corridor through the mediation of agro-pastoralist communities. Around the same time, a separate westward maritime dispersal of broomcorn millet brought this East Asian species to Northeast Africa. Some 100 grains of broomcorn millet recovered from tombs at Ukma in Nubia, dating to the Kerma period between 2000 and 1500 BCE, bear witness to the earliest phase of broomcorn millet consumption in Northeast Africa. In the reverse direction, wheat and barley, grain crops domesticated in Southwest Asia, were introduced to China between the 3rd and 2nd millennium BCE. Similarly, a range of other crops moved along east-west corridors at various junctures. Other significant Central Asian and East Asian crops moving into Iron Age Europe include apricots, peaches, hemp, pistachios, and carrots. The domesticated apple also traces part of its genetic ancestry to a species native to Central Asia. The sea lanes of Afro-Eurasia also saw vibrant crop transfers. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, sub-Saharan African crops like sorghum, finger millet, pearl millet, hyacinth bean, cowpea, and castor found their way into peninsular India. In the reverse direction, tropical Asian crops including banana, taro, and yams entered sub-Saharan Africa in the 1st millennium BCE. These few examples underscore the vast scale, complexity, and varied trajectories of crop movements across ancient Afro-Eurasia. One particular trajectory stands out in terms of scale and impact in this early diffusion of crops, namely the transmission of tropical Asian crops to the Middle East and the Mediterranean from the late Bronze Age onwards. This was a long-drawn process involving a variety of crops including Asian rice, cotton, citruses, sesame, cucumbers, melons, sugarcane, banana, taro, eggplant, mung bean, spinach, Sebastian plum, mango, and coconut, among others. The region of origin for these crops falls in the tropical and subtropical zones extending between latitude 28 degrees north and 9 degrees south from Papua New Guinea to northwestern India. Broadly speaking, these crops are characterized by high hydrothermal requirements and are hence typically summer irrigated crops in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The westward oceanic and terrestrial movement of tropical and subtropical Asian crops to the Middle East and the Mediterranean has been described by the archaeologist Andrew Sherratt as the most important movement of crops before the Columbian exchange. In the view of the Ottoman historian Alan Mikhail, these crops were crucial to the creation of a unified ecological context zone across Afro-Eurasia. Collectively, tropical Asian crops constituted the largest group of introduced aliens in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. As a result of this and related crop movements, the broader Afro-Eurasian landmass not only shared overlapping sets of cultivars and livestock from the late Bronze Age onwards, but also agricultural practices, labor regimes, technologies, and foodways. The associated circulation of weeds, pests, and pathogenic microbial organisms also meant that the profile of plant, animal, and human diseases was increasingly similar across the broader region. Weeds could significantly alter local ecologies, including soil conditions. A number of these, including horse purslane, buttonweed, and creeping wood sorrel, were introduced to the Middle East and the Mediterranean in antiquity through the transoceanic shipment of grain. Some feral plants along the coast of Oman, including the colorful garden balsam, are natives of South Asia that were presumably spread as weeds by traveling humans, and in some cases the animals accompanying them. A growing body of paleoentomological finds also provides evidence for the transcontinental movement of pests through processed foods, including flower and plants. The red flower beetle, lesser grain borer, and capra beetle that you see on the slide over here are South Asian species that appear in Middle Eastern and Mediterranean archaeological records from the 2nd millennium BCE onwards. Similarly, the Baluchistan melonfly shares an eastern center of origin and becomes a major pest of cucurbids in the Middle East by the 1st millennium BCE. The coalescing of crop cultures across the Afro-Eurasian world was in the first place premised on knowledge transfers. Plant diffusion requires knowledge of its uses as well as growing, harvesting, and processing techniques, soil, climatic, and water requirements, and strategies to deter pests. This knowledge transmission and cultural exchange forms the basis for subsequent agricultural intensification and innovation, including normalizing dual season cultivation, extending irrigation networks, reclaiming marginal lands for cultivation, and embracing new agricultural technologies. The cultivation of citrus fruits led, for example, to the introduction and spread of detached scion grafting techniques in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Rice, taro, and the sacred lotus may have been adopted in several regions of the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean as part of a strategy to reclaim previously marginal environments, such as wetlands, that were unsuited to the cultivation of traditional staples such as wheat and barley. This is also the case with cotton, which tolerates cultivation in mildly arid zones and slightly saline soils. The 1st century CE author Dioscorides points to the cultivation of rice in marshes and wetlands, while Herodotus in the 5th century BCE notes that the sacred lotus growing in the Nile, among other edible aquatic flora, made the acquisition of food more economical. The evasion of taxation regimes focused on traditional grain crops, namely wheat and barley, may have also informed the uptake of new crops in marginal environments. Being part of such a shadow economy entails that these crops leave a light paper trail at the outset. The earliest appearances of rice in Akkadian textual records of the Middle East, dating between the 12th and 7th centuries BCE, are accordingly sparse. A comparable case is found in 13th century Spain and Italy, where rice was cultivated by poorer groups in marshlands, too damp for wheat and rarely taxed. Yet the same Akkadian records indicate that rice was also adopted by the state as an experimental crop. A fragmentary letter from an Assyrian official to the governor of Kalhu, Madan Nimrud, in the late 8th century BCE, is significant in this regard. The letter, which recounts the flight of cultivators from the village of Sidki in northern Iraq, notes that none of them, the cultivators, agree to stay and to cultivate their seed grain. They have abandoned the rice, kurangu, they were sowing. The cultivators' flight was perhaps prompted by conflict, plague, or all too common pest infestation. But state coercion and willful desertion are not implausible contexts either. While modern scholarly approaches typically frame the regularization of summer cropping in the context of food security and marketable surplus, the drudgery and undesirability of summer cultivation and its potentially exploitative underbelly deserves further consideration. After all, the intensified cultivation of tropical and subtropical crops in the early modern Americas, including the likes of rice, cotton, indigo, and sugarcane, were intimately linked with slave labor. While rice may have been adopted by some communities as a way to get around fiscal obligations, there is also evidence for its integration into state-led and top-down cultivation processes. Imperial agency was also central to the procurement of new plants, including economically useful ones. Experimentation within royal botanical gardens could be the starting point for the wider dissemination of a crop. Transplanting rare and foreign plants allowed political elites to display their territorial control and diplomatic engagements. Such was the case with tree cotton in Assyria and present-day northern Iraq. The inscriptions of the 7th century BC Assyrian king Sin-ahe-eriba, popularly known as Sennacherib, indicate that cotton cultivation began in this region as part of a palace textile industry. But the cotton in Sennacherib's estates in Nineveh was also intended to convey a political statement. Assyrian gardens from at least the 12th century BC onwards took on a pronounced political dimension and functioned as a microcosm of the empire. Sennacherib's cotton was but one botanical element in a landscaping strategy meant to evoke the marshlands, the Agamu of southern Babylonia, which was from an Assyrian perspective, a politically volatile region harboring recalcitrant rebels. The growing of cotton in palace estates translated to a symbolic subjugation of this region. The fact that cotton was seen as diagnostic of southern Babylonia in Assyria also indicates that this crop, which originated in India, had successfully indigenized itself in Babylonia. The gifting of rare plants was also a means of sustaining patronage and diplomatic networks. The 4th century BC Attic comic playwright Antiphanes makes references to the seeds of the citron coming to Athens from the Persian king. Seleucus I, the successor to the largest part of Alexander's empire, was the recipient of a number of Indian crops. Pliny reports his failed attempts at cultivating amomum, nard, and cinnamon in Syria, while early Hellenistic physicians with links to Seleucus's court, including Menodorus, report the arrival of seeds belonging to a new Indian cucurbit species. Contextual evidence, alongside later archaeological and art historical data, suggests that this cucurbit is the loofah or the sponge god. These plants presumably arrived through Seleucid diplomatic networks with Mauryan India. That such exchanges also encompassed botanical materials with pharmaceutical applications is evident in the 3rd century BCE historical writer Phylacus' notice that the Mauryan king Chandragupta gifted aphrodisiacs to Seleucus I, which was said to have made men as randy as birds. The convergence of crop cultures was also aided by the spread of plants that resembled pre-existing crops, whether in morphology, taste, or uses. The new arrivals were frequently confused or conflated with existing plants and not lexically distinguished until much later. This was the case with cucumbers, lemons, taro, Sebastian plum, and a variety of rhubarb, which moved into the Middle East and the Mediterranean from regions further east. Many members of the cucurbit family, including melons and cucumbers, are known for their polymorphic fruits. The variety of melon that was familiar in the ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean frequently took on elongate and non-sweet forms, as you see on the screen. The morphological and gustatory resemblance of melons to true cucumbers, which originated in northern India, facilitated the latter's spread in the late 1st millennium BCE, as it was probably mistaken as a variety of melon. The melon itself was the product of earlier 4th millennium BCE crop movements from tropical Asian and African centers of domestication. In many ancient languages of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, including Akkadian, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, true cucumbers were not distinguished from melons at the outset. In Greek, the term sikouos was applied on both melons and cucumbers. Greek papyri from Roman Egypt, dating between the 1st and 3rd century CE, are the first documents in the Mediterranean region to distinguish true cucumbers, applying the diminutive sikudia or sikudion to distinguish smaller true cucumbers from larger melons. Similarly, lemons and citrons, the first citrus species to arrive in the Middle East and the Mediterranean from South Asia, were not distinguished lexically at the outset. Only archaeological evidence in the form of seeds and pollen, as well as art historical data, allows for the reconstruction of the chronology of their movements. In the case of the Sebastian plum and rhubarb, existing familiarity with similar plants was important in the acceptance of these new species. Over 50 varieties of edible rhubarb are spread across Europe and in the regions between Europe and China, but the westward movement of one easterly species can be tracked by both vocabulary and documentary sources. A tablet from the 5th century BCE Persepolis fortification archives attests to the movement of rhubarb seeds from Bactria in present-day Afghanistan to the imperial Persian heartland in southwestern Iran. The use of an Iranian loanword for rhubarb in ancient Greek, namely reon and ra from the old Iranian raba, also points to the movement of an eastern rhubarb species into regions further west. Yet locally available rhubarb species were also exploited, since the 1st century CE author Dioscorides refers to rhubarb growing north of the lands beyond the Bosphorus. The migration of easterly rhubarb species continued into later periods. We have, for example, Byzantine Greek texts, medical texts from the 13th century referring to a variety of Indian rhubarb, also called barbarian rhubarb in some of the sources. Like rhubarb, the Sebastian plum, scientific name is Cordia myxa, produces sticky fruits that were used as a calorific source, as medicine, and for trapping birds. And this was integrated into the Eastern Mediterranean as a result of pre-existing familiarity with another species, namely the gray-leaved saucer berry. Both the Sebastian plum and the gray-leaved saucer berry belong to the genus Cordia, and they produce pulpy, sweet-tasting fruits that grow as ovoid drupes in clusters, as you see on the screen. They're both consumed fresh, desiccated, or pickled. The sticky pulp of both species is boiled and used as glue that is smeared on tree branches for trapping birds. The Sebastian plum is an eastern species that's native to the regions between mainland Southeast Asia and Iran, while the gray-leaved saucerberry has a wider distribution, including tropical and subtropical Africa, the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian subcontinent. The use of the gray-leaved saucerberry is attested in Egyptian archaeological context from at least the 4th millennium BCE. The Sebastian plum, on the other hand, arrived in Egypt, possibly through Red Sea trading routes, no later than the 3rd century BCE. The easy integration of the Sebastian plum into Egyptian and Levantine cultures was no doubt a result of existing familiarity with the native gray-leaved saucerberry. The use of Sebastian plums would widen in the Roman period, since its fruit stones, possibly exported from North Africa, are tested at the ports of Pula and Zaton in Croatia and Nîmes and Marseille in southern France between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Pliny, in the 1st century CE, also notes that Sebastian plums were introduced and cultivated in the Italian peninsula. In the case of cotton, pre-existing familiarity with growing a textile crop like flax may have eased its introduction, as did existing hydraulic structures in the forms of irrigation canals. This explains the easy uptake of cotton in regions like southern Babylonia, which already grew flax and had an extensive irrigation network. In some cases, the arrival of a new crop could also stimulate the use of a previously unexploited local species. Contact with Indian cotton probably encouraged the exploitation of a local African cotton species. Since the finds of African cotton are chronologically posterior to that of Indian cottons, plus loanwords indicate an eastern entry point for cotton in both the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Cultivation failures could also inspire the growing of local substitutes. Pepper, a native of southwestern India, was available in the Mediterranean from at least the 5th century BCE, but could never grow locally owing to environmental impediments. This led to the use of a range of local substitutes. Pliny reports that the berries of other plants like juniper and myrtle were passed off as pepper. Rabbinical sources of the early to mid-centuries of the Common Era make the outlandish claim that pepper grew in Palestine. More likely, this referred to the cultivation of a pepper substitute, perhaps Ethiopian or Kimba pepper, which is extracted from the pods of a tree native to sub-Saharan Africa. While the spread of tropical Asian crops in the Middle East and the Mediterranean led to coherence in agricultural know-how and labor practices, cultural cohesion was, however, limited, as new crops were processed and used in ways familiar to the host region. Besides adapting to local environments and climatic cycles, new comestible crops had to conform with existing crop processing techniques, culinary traditions, and notions of taste. Modes of cooking and consumption applied to crops in their areas of origin did not migrate or were ignored. In the case of rice, it was primarily consumed in the ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean as bread, cake, mash, or porridge. While the gluten-free nature of rice does not make it an ideal grain for baking, it was nevertheless ground into flour, baked, and consumed as bread, much like the native staples of wheat and barley. In his treatise on bread making, the 2nd or 1st century BCE Greek author Chrysippos of Tyana describes, for example, a flead bread or cake made of rice. A similar bread may already be referred to in a fragment of the Athenian dramatist Sophocles. These cooking preferences persisted into the medieval period. The 8th century CE Korean Buddhist monk Hecho observes that in Persia, rice was ground into flour and made into pastries. Such cooking techniques were not the default way of consuming rice in the regions of Asia where it was domesticated. In East, South, and Southeast Asia, rice is primarily consumed as steamed or boiled grain, although it was also ground into flour and used in steamed or griddled dishes. These cultures also developed cooking wares that accommodated steaming and boiling practices. The peoples of late Neolithic and Iron Age South India, for example, used a kind of perforated ware that possibly functioned as a steaming tray for dishes made from rice, pulse, and millet batters. Steaming and boiling grain were not common practices in the ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean. In Mesopotamia, the scarcity of fuel may have dissuaded the adoption of such cooking methods. Yet even within Asia, there were varying preferences for rice types, even if the cooking methods of steaming and boiling were widely shared. In parts of East and Southeast Asia, there is a strong preference for sticky and glutinous rice types with a higher content of the waxy starch amylopectin. The products of new crops were also adapted for use in existing foods and beverages. Citruses, for example, were used to flavor wine in the ancient Mediterranean. This practice has been traced in both documentary and archaeological sources. Residues of a flavonoid or organic chemical compound found exclusively in the citrus genus was traced in a wine jug deposited in a 6th century BCE grave at the Phoenician necropolis of Monte Sirai in southern Sardinia. Similarly, rice, according to a commentary to the dramatist Aristophanes' Hippias, was added to thrion, a traditional fig-leaved wrapped savory dish. Besides culinary uses, new crops also gained social, symbolic, and cultural meanings that were unique to the host region. Citruses, as the Monte Sirai jug demonstrates, were integrated into local religious and funerary traditions. In 3rd century CE Egypt, citrus leaves were also strung into funerary garlands. An earlier 1st century CE Pompeian panel also attests for the use of lemons in ornamental, floral, and fruit garlands. The citron was also retrofitted into the Jewish festival of Sukkot by the 2nd century BCE. While the biblical book of Leviticus only describes the fruit of the goodly tree in the context of this festival, rabbinical commentators and other authors, including Josephus, universally identified this fruit as the citron. From the 1st century of the Common Era onwards, the citron also regularly appears in Levantine Jewish and Christian art, including sarcophagi reliefs, church and synagogue mosaics, coins, oil lamps, and other ritual objects. As the citron bore flowers and fruits all year round, it was an ideal symbol of eternal life and enduring prosperity. Such symbolism is also attested in Indian contexts. Kubera, a wealth-endowing Indian deity, is, for example, often pictured with a citron in his hand from at least the 3rd century of the Common Era. Whether such symbolism was inherited or the result of convergent developments remains unclear. Like the citron, the sacred lotus also developed religious associations in the Mediterranean, much as it did in South Asia. The 2nd century CE Greek author Athenaeus refers, for example, to a temple of Athena Colocasia, or Athena of the Lotus, at Sicyon in the northern Peloponnese. This temple was presumably flanked by water bodies with sacred lotuses, or the lotus was perhaps integrated into the imagery of Athena at this site. Further east, a 4th century CE Sasanian relief of the Iranian god Mithra shows him standing atop an open sacred lotus at Taki Bustan. The imagery found here may have been directly influenced by Hindu and Buddhist imagery from South and Central Asia. In the Indo-Iranian borderlands and Central Asia, local Iranian gods were depicted through Indian imagery from at least the 2nd century of the Common Era. While some local uses of crops were different from their applications in the regions that they came from, some functions, like their role in religious traditions, show convergent developments, and in a few cases, direct connections. The use of the rhizome and the seed pod of the sacred lotus as food, and its leaves as vessels and parasols, are attested in both India and Roman Egypt, suggesting a direct transmission of knowledge pertaining to crop uses. Similarly, the use of rice as nourishment for those with gastrointestinal afflictions is known throughout its introduced range, suggesting that medical knowledge was conveyed together with the crop and may have offered an incentive for its local cultivation. The medical uses of rice, in particular its use as a cure for stomach ailments, are prominent in Mediterranean texts of the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. The discovery of 196 charred grains of rice at a Roman military hospital, a valetudinarium at Novasium, Neuss am Rhein in Germany, reinforces the importance of rice as medicine in the broader European region. By the end of the first millennium BCE, plants originating in tropical Asia had become an integral part of the ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean. The gods of Babylon were dressed in cotton, rice grew along the royal thoroughfares of southwestern Persia, sacred lotuses flowered in the shadow of Egypt's pyramids, and citruses adorned the wealthy estates of southern Italy. The same crops also took root in humble house gardens and met the subsistence requirements of peoples occupying marginal environments like marshlands. Though plants of distant origins became part of the fabric of everyday life in the ancient Middle East and the Mediterranean, regionalism and insularity persisted with crop processing techniques and cooking techniques as well. Patterns of consumption also varied with place, social status, gender, and age. The 1st century CE author Plutarch informs us that many older people still cannot eat ripe cucumber, citron, or pepper, all of which find origin in India. Quite often, the plants that proved successful were also those that proved to be low-risk additions to existing farming systems and those that resembled familiar crops in morphology, usage, and taste. While some crops spread with their cultural associations, many took on new cultural meanings and identities in their host regions. Crop migrations were not linear, inexorable, uninterrupted globalizing processes, but fluid ones, marked by selection, rejection, integration, adaptation, and reformulation. The end result, however, was an Afro-Eurasian world characterized by shared crop cultures and increasingly familiar foodways. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Suresh, for this incredible overview and a huge amount of information for us all to digest. You spoke a lot about adaptation of crop to local lifeways or the kinds of knowledge that came with it. I wonder if you could say something more about the way that the introduction of certain crops might have been used to manage or might have affected local climate or environmental situations. So rivers that might have been, and flood that might have been managed in certain ways by the introduction of crops, or other ways that they were accidentally or intentionally used for ecological change.
Yeah, because they have high hydrothermal requirements, that inevitably leads to landscape modification. In some cases, it's just the extension of pre-existing irrigation networks, which is why cotton and rice proved to be successful in southern Babylonia, because they already had the infrastructure for it. They just needed to expand it. And some other cases, you had to build it from scratch, but there's less evidence for that in antiquity. That seems to be more of a phenomenon that of the later period, and in particular when the Arabs come into the Mediterranean and introduce new forms of irrigation, especially in southern Spain and North Africa. So that kind of explains why the uptake of these new crops was very patchy. It tends to be people with pre-existing hydraulic technologies that support these crops that adopt them as a whole, in at least until the Roman period, I would say.
Yes, thank you so much for this incredibly rich overview. I have a very specific question. I'm curious about, you mentioned that by the early 7th century, cotton or Babylonia was already perceived as typical for cotton planting. Could you say a few more words about when you believe cotton was introduced in Babylonia and in which ways?
Yeah, so it's only recently that a word for cotton has been identified in Akkadian, in Babylonian texts in particular, called kedinu. The earliest appearance of that term is in the 11th century BCE, but it's actually in a copy made in the Neo-Babylonian period of an old inscription. So, we have to rely in some ways on that this is an authentic record of an older attestation for this crop. But otherwise, the most concrete appearance of this is in Sennacherib's inscriptions. But there we don't get any contextual information as to where it's coming from. Like it's seen as a Babylonian crop. He's also planting a lot of other Babylonian aquatic plants to recreate this marshscape within his royal gardens. So it's seen very much as a Babylonian crop. But when exactly it gets to Babylonia is a question mark. I propose that it's a late Bronze Age introduction because we do see a lot of Kassite interactions with the Persian Gulf, which include extended, indirect contacts with India at the same time. There's archaeological evidence, for example, from Phailaika, where there was a Kassite governor installed, and there's lots of archaeological materials that can trace their origin back to South Asia there as well. So I would say it's a 12th, 11th century BC introduction based on a combined reading of both the textual and the archaeological data here.
Thank you very much. And that was an amazing talk and fantastically revelatory. And I think my question might just follow on from John's, but I noticed that quite a lot of the transfers you documented are going into societies that are quite centralized or imperial and so on. And I mean, I wondered whether that means that other kinds of societies like mountaineers, forest dwellers, steppe dwellers are less affected. But then I remembered your early slide, which had an image which I think was from Fuller and Boivin, showing material coming from East Asia into tropical Africa, presumably into societies that are not like that. So my question is, in these transfers you've outlined, does it get everywhere? Or are we seeing this more diverse and unified crop culture appearing in the centralized states, but not really touching the less centralized areas around them?
Thank you. That's a great question. So with the tropical transfers, because they're intertropical transfers, there's less of an issue with negotiating climate and environment, because they're broadly speaking rather similar environments. So it didn't need state efforts to expand infrastructure in that regard. But I also think part of the problem here is the bias of the documentary sources and where they tell us these plants are growing. From an archaeological perspective, it seems that they're also appearing in sites that appear to be marginal or provincial. So one of the earliest references to rice is in a sort of Assyrian satellite city, like up in northern Syria. And it's not attested in the imperial royal heartlands. So it seems to have spread quite early on to some of these provincial centers as well. But at the same time, it is connected with local centers of power. There are local agents somehow involved in this. Like there's already a reference to irrigation in that early text mentioning rice. So there's some kind of communal effort involved in growing this crop even there. So yes, I do think there needs to be some kind of pre-existing infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily need to be imperial ones. It seems to be working well at the local level as well. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I was really struck by the way you concluded your talk with the response to cucumber, citron, and pepper in one part of the ancient world. And I'm also struck by the title of your book, The Tropical Turn. And of course, in scholarship, we talk about various turns, the material turn, the landscape turn, and so on. So I wonder if you can talk about the tropical turn and also talk about it as a framing device for your book. That would be really helpful for those of us who are not familiar with this sort of direction that the scholarship is moving in.
Thank you. So I was struggling with the title for a long time because a lot of people who have worked on this phenomenon have often described it as a revolution. The most famous author in this regard is, of course, Andrew Watson, who framed this as the Islamic Green Revolution or the medieval Green Revolution. And I thought the word revolution is really problematic because it suggests, there is one particular moment in time and one political actor that was responsible for these movements. But they were really long drawn out and they were episodic and repeated processes. So I wanted to capture that temporality in this word. So a turn could be quick or it could be slow. Right? And that made more sense to me rather than something that implied that this was, transformative at the outset.
Yeah, thank you so much for the very, fascinating talk. You mentioned that some Sub-Saharan African crop actually, moved to South Asia and they pay millets and coal. I was going to ask, of course, it's interesting to see that agricultural innovation is also part of the title of your book. So is there any evidence, or perhaps if you can speak to any possibility of the technology of, domestication of that crop also moving with the crop? Is there any evidence like that? Because we often talk about technology moving to Sub-Saharan Africa, but we don't really look at the technology from Sub-Saharan Africa going outside. So is there any, can you speak to that? Is there anything from the record that you deal with that speaks to that part of it?
Yeah, that's a great question, but a lot of the documentary sources are very incidental in their references to the transfer of technology. But for citrus fruits, for example, we can say quite confidently that techniques of grafting moved alongside the spread of these species. There were other technological innovations that were entirely local. For example, the idea of an orangery, right, storing citrus fruits in a glass house over winter. That was very much a Middle Eastern Mediterranean phenomenon because there was no need for that in the regions that it originated from. So there are two kinds of, technological processes here, local innovations and those that migrate with the crop as well. And also the cultural uses that I talked about. Some of these were deliberately ignored, others were adopted depending on the local need for such a technology or cultural use.
Was transport always by seeds, or is there evidence for transport of entire plants or cuttings or?
There are some references to transport of plant cuttings and entire plants. We do see them on some art historical materials as well. But it's not, I can't quantitatively say which was the sort of default method of transporting plants. We don't, it seems to be a mixture of both. And it also depended on who was carrying these plants and for what purposes. And that is very variable as well. One thing that I always emphasize is that, when people talk about these transcontinental connections, the sort of knee-jerk response is to say that, traders were moving them. But I actually think that's a very lazy response to connectivity, right? There are lots of other mobile peoples involved in these processes, including people who get deported, for example. The Assyrian Empire is famous for pioneering these massive deportations, and the peoples moving with their foods and crops, and you see that in some of these art historical materials as well. In Ptolemaic Egypt, one thing that's interesting is that the Greek colonists who are moving in from elsewhere in the Mediterranean are bringing in their own crops, like cabbage from Rhodes, for example. And that's not because Egypt was lacking in cabbage. The Greeks just thought that the cabbage that grew back in home was better tasting than the ones that they found in Egypt, right? But they were the same species scientifically. So there's this idea of crop branding that's going on in antiquity as well. We still do it today. You go to a foreign country, you relocate, you buy stuff back from home that you find endearing, that reminds you of where you came from. That's what people in antiquity are doing. They're bringing their own foods and plants with them. And sometimes that conservatism also helps the spread of crops. So it's not just a case of people innovating and wanting to try new things. The plants are moving because people are conservative and they're forced to move.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I want to follow up on the agents for crop transfer, I would invite you to speculate as to whether we can think about non-human agents and specifically migratory birds. Now, this doesn't address the issue of knowledge transfer because at some point you will have needed some savoir-faire to get this stuff going. But especially for Western Afro-Eurasia, we do have migratory birds that traverse fairly long distances and that scatter plants and that have stopover sites in densely agriculturally populated settlement areas. So I'm curious about this. I know nothing beyond a very impressionistic sense that migratory birds may have been involved with a few of these, maybe.
That's a great question. I think that is true in some cases, especially with weeds. But for the crops that I described, the economically important ones, you can also trace their movement in documentary sources and loanwords. So that's a very clear sort of east to west connection there that is accompanied by some kind of knowledge transfer. In the Persian Gulf region, for example, especially along the coast of Oman, you find a lot of weeds, like plants that are just growing feral, that are not native to the region. They are of South Asian origin. and they were presumably spread by animals traveling along with the humans, or even just regular migratory species. There's a Buddhist story called the Baviru Jataka, where these Indians are going to Babylon, and they try to sell a peacock and a crow to the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are astonished by both of these animals because they've not seen either. It's actually an allegory for the peacock representing Buddhism and the crow representing heretical stories and texts. But regardless, there are lots of textual references to people traveling with all kinds of animals, and also the unintended animals like the geckos, the pests, insects, and so on. But not all of them would be carrying seeds of them, but there's that aspect to this biological movement as well.
Thank you. Well, let me join everybody else in saying thank you for that fantastic talk. I'm quite interested in transitional zones, so arid, semi-arid zones, but also in seasonality, and what seasons or lack of seasons would do to how things moved around. Is there anything in the work that you've done that sort of points to various seasonal rhythms of moving things at certain points in time through semi-arid regions or not, and also sort of the local nature of adapting or rejecting crops coming through or plants coming through, just simply based on the fact that you knew that it wouldn't survive in the dry season, for example.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that was interesting to me when I was working on this book was the fact that, the adoption of these plants does not really correlate with the, paleoclimatic data. There is a trend of increased aridity in parts of the early first millennium, but people are still adopting these very, water-hungry crops in spite of those, conditions. And of course, they would not have been conscious of it because these are, that's macro data that's not perceptible to local actors. What they would have been conscious of is microclimatic variations and interannual changes as well. And authors like Columella, for example, talk about that they're very aware of how the season changes so often. So they do come up with strategies to preserve these plants because they're usually summer irrigated crops. They're not sort of grown throughout the year. For example, cucurbits like melons and cucumbers, they are wheeled into these mica containers over winter to keep them safe, and citruses are planted along the edge of a estate so that the roof offers shelter to them in winter, or sometimes they are wheeled into these glass rooms as well. So there are local strategies that are being evolved to deal with these climatic changes. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, so while everyone finds their seats, I'll say that I'm very pleased to present Dr. Lara Fabian. It's not that often that I meet other Laras. I think you're maybe the second one. So Lara Fabian is an assistant professor of Iranian archaeology in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA, whose work focuses on Southwest Asia and in the Iron Age and later. Her current book project considers the material imprint of empire in its afterlife through an examination of the post-Achaemenid world. Her scholarship is informed by historiographic and reception studies on the development of thought about antiquity and the question of Iran and the Caucasus in the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, and post-Soviet Eurasia. As part of this wider research, she has co-authored collaborative Azerbaijani-American fieldwork in Azerbaijan since 2016. Before coming to UCLA, she worked on the Beyond the Silk Road ERC project at Albert Ludwig's Universität Freiburg. So with that, in the worldly step, let's give a round of applause.
So thank you so much for that introduction, and also to everybody who helped to organize this and helped to make sure that you weren't hearing my job talk from 2 years ago today instead of the proper talk. Today I'm going to be talking about the relationship between the Arsacid Empire and the Eurasian steppe, the inland sea of grass that stretches from Eastern Europe to the edges of East Asia, a territory that Pushkin, in one of his poems, calls the worldly steppe, Steppe Mirskaya. I'll be discussing the various communities who inhabited this steppe space in the late 1st millennium BC and early 1st millennium CE. These steppe residents, generally considered pastoralists of various shades and imprecisely named in ancient texts as Scythians, Saka, Sarmatians, Yuchi, and others, and characterized archaeologically by rich burials, by animal style, metalwork, and others, and symbols like these, like tamgas, which is actually sort of a sub-theme of my talk today, which were used to mark property, affiliation, and authority. Today, I'm interested in how we should best conceptualize their relationship with the Arsacid dynasty that developed and ruled over the Arsacid or the Parthian Empire, which rose in the 3rd century BC in the aftermath of Alexander III's massive reorganizations of Southwest Asia. Just to briefly lay out the geography, we're talking about a Parthian world that's focused on, laser pointer, on this sort of part of the Iranian plateau going up into the Caucasus and down to the Persian Gulf, and a steppe located up here stretching all the way across the grasslands. The steppe communities dwelling up here were connected to each other variably through stories of migration and descent, and they can all be described using the traditional nomenclature of nomads. As to their relationship with the Arsacid Empire, the question, based largely on ancient textual sources, has long been framed simply as, were the Parthians descended from these nomads, and was their later empire nomadic in character? Recent scholarship like this of Matt Canepa on the Arsacid space has rightly criticized the static view of the Parthians as nomads as reductive. But there remains a need for more engagement with the question of what precisely the Arsacid interactions with the steppe actually were over the longue durée. And more importantly, how we might talk about these relationships in terms that are more nuanced than focusing simply on narratives of origin or ethnogenesis. Because the connections between the steppe and the sedentary world of places like Iran, but also China and Rome, were deep and extensive and meaningful. The problem is, however, that for reasons that I will be discussing here today, these connections speak to us in absolute whispers. I began with a discussion of nomadism and heterarchy as tools for understanding steppe social structure and power flows. I then will explore how scholars have approached the steppe and the classical world, and will situate the Arsacid Empire and the Iranian world in this discourse, before turning to this question of the tamga, to use the Turkic word, or the nishan, to use the Persian word, these symbols of power and how they're used in the Arsacid sphere as evidence of steppe-linked connectivity that is often obscured by sedentary biases. Nomad has fallen out of favor among scholars of the ancient world in recent decades, criticized for its pejorative coloring and its oversimplification of the wider panoply of non-sedentary lifeways into a single category. The concept has, at the same time, seen a resurgence in popular culture, with the phenomenon of the digital nomad entering the lexicon in the late 1990s. This resurgence of the nomad in the form of digital nomadism is relevant for my talk today because I will argue, I think that there are actually some structural socioeconomic frameworks that have enabled digital nomadism that also, on a conceptual level, mirror anthropological observations about pastoralist communities in the deep past. In the context of modernity, two preconditions for the emergence of this digital nomadism have been, first of all, a growing deterritorialization, and second of all, increasing decentralization of work regimes. Technological changes like mobile computing enabled the technical side of this, while a broader cultural shift that de-emphasized physical presence at, for example, corporate headquarters, which is so clearly visible in the post-pandemic urban life, facilitated the social relationships that underlied this. These twinned ideas of decentralization and some type of deterritorialization, or rather some other idea of how you do territory, are both points that recent anthropological thinking about pastoralists have stressed. This is one such model from Michael Frichetti's 2012 work on non-uniform complexity. Decentralized, low-density steppe societies generally tended, and there's big asterisks on all of this, right? But they generally tended towards heterarchical organization, which is to say segmented, polycentric, and highly peer-networked forms of organization. Although, of course, there were also periods of hierarchical consolidation, and hierarchy and heterarchy aren't actually dichotomous in this way. Anyways, steppe heterarchy tends towards segmentation, towards polycentricity, and towards lateral networking. And beyond political organization, which is the focus of so much of the research of steppe societies, it also affected how ideas and information moved in this space. In such decentralized systems, what network theory tends to call distributed networks, information spreads laterally through these resilient peer-to-peer links. But this type of hierarchy, these decentralized and distributed systems, also create tremendous diversity, even inside of communities that are closely related. Each packet of information, after it spreads within the network, can potentially evolve and develop independently within its specific local context. Thus, the eventual physical manifestations of ideas that have traveled around networks that look like the distributed one can vary considerably, even as the conceptual understanding below the idea might remain a little bit more stable. The inclination to variation inside of these spaces is one of the things that has, I think, confounded our thinking about the steppe, because we too often fail to recognize the commonalities across space and time, fooled by their superficially different manifestations. The inclination to variation has often obscured underlying coherence or coherence of ideas between these societies, even in the face of considerable difference in lifeways. Recognizing that the space tends towards a distributed hierarchical logic is crucial, not only for understanding how these spaces functioned in their own right, but also for thinking about how things and ideas, symbols that are behind the things, like the Tomga symbols I'm going to talk about today, move across regions and across empires. Before we get to that, though, I have to provide a little bit of historiographic framing to the question of Parthians, nomads, or not. Thus, in what follows is a brief introduction to the place that the Eurasian steppe has had in constructions of the classical world, and indeed in wider civilizational narratives that have developed all across Eurasia, from the Mediterranean to China. The steppe has been a deeply challenging place for generations of scholars. The field has been shaped by profound biases and negative perceptions of dangerous nomads, problems that are not improved by the lack of emic textual sources from the steppe peoples. Pastoralist communities with their smaller material footprint are difficult to see archaeologically. And the Eurasian steppe, spread across a number of countries and for most of the 20th century either behind or inside of the Iron Curtain, depending on your perspective, offered its own particular challenges for researchers. While not exhaustive, what follows is a brief journey through three dominant scholarly approaches to this space before an attempt to situate the Arsacids within that. We start with the really easy idea, right? Which is that the steppe has always existed, and by always I mean since the beginning of written historical narrative, has always existed in opposition to the sedentary world. This dichotomous framing of steppe communities as a fundamental others is really the oldest. It appears in ancient thought from Herodotus to Simachin. These texts cast the steppe as the edge of the known world, where, despite the clear ethnographic interests of the authors, its people were very much not us. They are defined in that way. And sometimes they're even a little bit otherworldly. On a more concrete level, nomads appeared threatening both for their raiding and for their resistance to incorporation into sedentary governance. The perception of steppe predation, as well as a sharp steppe-zone dichotomy, has played a role in this modern theory of nomadic dependency, which has been prominent in studies of the rise of supra-regional steppe network nomadic powers at the edge of sedentary empires. So as Owen Lattimore wrote, "It is the poor nomad who is a pure nomad." Nomadic society was, according to this model, inherently marginal, and thus any nomadic society that was not living at the bare minimum must have been reliant on some form of parasitic economic extraction, coercing sedentary agriculturalists to provide. This brings us, interestingly, to the next trope about the steppe, mobility, the hallmark of the pastoralists. Herodotus, one quote from which you see here, notes that the constant motion makes them hard to govern. He says, how can they not be invincible and unapproachable? This idea of constant movement in the steppe has also often come up and arisen and turned into a narrative of migration. So not just motion of communities, but long distance migrations across space. And this idea of migration and the idea of the space as one of unbounded mobility has been a key focus of modern scholarship. This image, which is from Sulimirski's 1970 textbook on the Sarmatians, reflects that scholarly tradition, especially prominent in Soviet-era archaeology, but present outside of it, which frames the steppe as a zone of unending migration. You see here the various steppe groups and their paths. These intricate schema, often grounded in scant evidence, mapped group after group, reforming and migrating in ways that modern archaeology increasingly questions. In recent years, many of the migrationist models that have sought to connect groups named in the text to movements of populations have been shown to be exaggerated and to have underemphasized the role of local developments visible in the archaeological record. Even more broadly, recent interdisciplinary work like Spengler's, which is posted on the slide, has demonstrated that residents in the Central Asian steppe, at least during the 2nd and 1st millennia BC, were not as mobile as had been assumed, and this is Lynn Rouse's work, and also engaged in more complicated mixed economies with significant components of agriculturalism. And yet, the enduring mobility has remained a trope, especially as new methods of ADNA research have reinvigorated debates about the deeper history of human and animal mobility in this space. The most important contributions of this ADNA research concern periods significantly earlier than my talk today, the very early migrations of the Yamanaya culture with their homeland in the Western steppe, the most likely ancestor for Indo-European languages, and this is from this brand new 2025 Nature article. Ongoing work on horse domestication also plays a role in this story, horse domestication in the Bronze and Iron Ages. And all of this has been used to argue that, in fact, the steppe is this heart of out-migrations that create Indo-European linguistic communities and Indo-European cultural spheres. Despite the focus on migration and mobility, another prominent strand of thought about the steppe has considered it the space of ethnogenesis. And indeed, one can see that embedded in the discourse about ADNA, right? The spread of Indo-European languages and modern horse-based culture is at once a story about migration and also one about origin, about where we're really from. Inside of Russian archaeological thought, meanwhile, the discussion of the steppe and ethnogenesis is yet more complicated. The crux of the story lies in the various configurations that both Russian and local communities under the Soviet Union drew between themselves and their own steppic past, imagined or not. The full contours of these relationships are far too expansive for me to sketch here today, so I'll limit myself to a few remarks. The image that you're looking at here is from a backdrop painted for the first production of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which shows kurgans, the typical steppe burials, and they're absolutely central space in the imagination of that particular piece of art. The first major component in this Russian discourse has to do with self-identity. Over the course of the 19th century and with echoes into the Soviet period, narratives about the history of the Slavs placed them on a steppic continuum, albeit as sedentarists. And this is a really complicated story, and we can talk about it more if anybody's interested in the details. But essentially, the narrative, one prominent narrative painted the Slavs as the final in a line of steppe peoples that stretched back through the Sarmatians and the Scythians. Although these connections were eventually abandoned by scholars, the idea of a steppic heritage continued to offer a potent metaphor inside of Russian identity narratives. It furthermore became connected in broad terms with the idea behind a potent political ideology, namely Eurasianism. This idea that Russia is neither European nor Asian, but instead occupies a specific mediatory position between the two, based precisely on its steppe geography, is in its current instantiation a component of Russia's expansionist geopolitical program. The second part of this discourse about the steppe and origins concerns the development of local histories for subject populations inside of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet territories, ethnogenesis, which was a topic that in the early Soviet period was highly suspect, was operationalized beginning in the 1930s and through the post-war period. This work popularized narratives about deep autochthonous pasts based often on archaeological research for communities from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, which helped to develop a new set of Soviet national identities for all of the citizens of the Soviet Union. So to pull together these strands about the steppe, on the one hand, the residents of the steppe have long been cast by neighboring sedentary societies as fundamentally other, the restless, the predatory wanderer in perpetual motion. However, the steppe has also been positioned as a sort of civilizational cradle. This stems from its role as the presumed homeland of Indo-European languages, as well as the site of fundamental civilizational evolutions like the sophisticated use of domesticated horses. Inside of the space of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, meanwhile, a different and more complex set of identity relationships positioned the steppe as an integral part of Russian national identity, but also at the heart of state-supported narratives for the local communities dwelling in these modern territories. All right, so I have now spoken for exactly half of my time, and you may be wondering where the Arsacids are in the story and how they're involved in it in any case. So here's the question from the beginning of the talk again. Were the Parthians rulers over the second, the longest lasting, and the absolutely enormous Parthian Empire? Were those people steppe nomads or not? This is a long-running discussion fueled by the fact, probably most particularly, that Strabo presents two options for understanding the etiology of the first Arsacid king, Arshak I. Some say that Arsaces derived his origin from the Scythians, whereas others say that he was Bactrian. Leaving aside the fact that Strabo also notes that, at least in the early times, the Bactrians were also themselves nomads, or, quote, did not differ much from the nomads in their modes of life and customs, it's understandable that Strabo's formulation attracted attention from the beginning of scholarship to the question of who exactly Arsaces I was. And one thing has always been totally clear to scholars focused on the Parthian world, to Iranian studies scholars. The Parthians were not the descendants of the earlier Achaemenids, who, despite their own historical connection to the world of the steppe, had moved far beyond their nomadic roots. In contrast to the glory of the Achaemenid Empire in this historiographic tradition, the Arsacid Empire has long been interpreted as an unfortunate period of civilizational stagnation in Iran. Or, put another way, although both the Achaemenids and the Parthians, and indeed many of the other communities of the steppe, were all speakers of Indo-Iranian languages and were all connected in the deep past, the Achaemenids were the real Iranians. This unfortunate deficit has often been explained as a function of the so-called nomadic roots of the first Arsacid kings. I show here a passage from Coolidge's 1977 Parthian Art to demonstrate how the discourse has been framed. Early Parthian rulers, however, issued no coins, this we now know not to be true, or commemorative monuments. Any building was primarily in mud, brick, clay, and wood. And as a people of recent nomad background, their foremost artistic interests were presumably still those of wanderers: weapons, animal trappings, leatherwork, textiles. This is 1977. Coolidge then sees a clear arc that begins with the nomadic roots and grows beyond them. This, by the way, is quite similar to what we see in, surprise, surprise, Strabo. As I noted at the start of the paper, there's general agreement today that we should not view the Arsacid Empire as a static entity. As Stefan Hauser said, die ewigen Nomaden. There is a problem with this formulation, though. As I briefly discussed a moment ago, our understanding of the steppe has shifted dramatically in recent years. We now recognize that although there have been moments of dramatic explosive migration in the space, there has also been a profound integration of the sedentary and mobile economic activities. The model for the ever-nomad that lies behind older studies on the Arsacids was a version of nomadism that never actually existed, even in the steppe. So no, the Arsacids weren't nomads in that sense, because nobody was. They did emerge, however, from a Central Asian space that has long been characterized by this type of hierarchical and tendentially less sedentary pattern of social and economic organization, wherein sedentary and mobile components of the wider community collaborated. We might well imagine that whoever Arsaces I was specifically, he existed in a world where steppe practices, and particularly ones connected to steppe elites, were widely familiar. Most importantly, there are some general and also some very specific elements of elite culture in the Arsacid period that suggest that, contrary to Coolidge's trajectory of a declining nomadic influence, the Arsacid engagement with steppe-based elite koine did not, in fact, disappear over time. It grew. These range from elements of Arsacid dress and weaponry to social practices like the prominence of horsemanship in elite culture. Many of these elements are frustratingly hard to track in a rigorous way. But like I said, rather than fading with time, they seem to have, at minimum, remained integral to elite culture under Arsacids rule, and in some cases expanded. And among these, and my attempt in the rest of this paper, and this is, for the record, a new body of research, this thing that I'm going to present on Tamga Nishan. It's a topic that Iranian studies scholars and people who work on the steppe have not been doing a great job about talking to each other about, and it's a very difficult and knotted problem. So the Tamgas, this use of these markers or nishans, personal identity, community affiliation markers, is one of the places where I'm going to argue we can see the lasting imprint of some of these connections. So, Tamgas, or nishans, to use the two terms respectively, are marks that have been associated with ownership and identity among pastoralist communities, thought to identify either a specific individual, a family, or a clan, and probably all of those things at different points in time. They're extremely common in steppic contexts, beginning definitely by the 3rd century BC, but it depends a little bit on where we are in the steppe. Although their history arguably stretches back to the Bronze Age, they become increasingly prominent in the course of the 1st millennium BC, starting our earliest good evidences from Central Asia, but the dating of a lot of this material is challenging. The two centers of use were in the Western steppe on the North Black Sea, that's a little bit later, and then in Central Asia a little bit earlier. In these contexts, Tamgas appear on a wide variety of materials and objects where marking ownership might be important, like on high-value mirrors and silver vessels, but also on reliefs, on petroglyph assemblages, on ceramics. In starting off, I have to acknowledge some of the problems with dealing with Tamgas. The Tamga phenomenon is extremely widespread, but the data are scattered, fragmentary, and frankly just sort of bafflingly complex. This is a map of Tamgas from the Western steppe, from the 1st and 2nd century CE, from Sergei Yatsenko's 2001 publication, which attempts to systematize the information. The territory in which these marks were used in antiquity stretches across a huge number of modern countries, which has led to the fragmentation of scholarship on the topic and has created a number of distinct silos of knowledge that are only in recent years beginning to be bridged. Tamgas are often really simple signals. If one's looking at just a single mark, it can be difficult to know if this is actually part of this conceptual tradition, or if it's just a potter's mark on a piece of ceramic, or a chance occurrence that's maybe not totally related. Tamgas can also show up in contexts where it's unclear whether they're marking identity or whether they're mason's marks or sculptor's signs. And some of those things may have overlapping conceptual backgrounds to them, but they present really dramatically different use cases. In their simple forms, and this slide is intentionally blank, they're easy to overlook. They don't get published a lot. Every time I go to a museum in the South Caucasus, I see dozens of pieces of ceramic that have really identifiable steppe Tamgas on them. They don't show up in any of the publications. Their wide distribution complicates interpretation, but so too does their multimodal use. They show up carved on inscriptions. They show up scratched on rocks. They show up impressed into coins. There are differences between communities in how these symbols are used. Sometimes a single sign always appears alone. Other times signs appear as part of these huge, they call them petroglyph encyclopedia, Tamga encyclopedias, these huge stones that have dozens and dozens of these. Materials marked by Tamgas vary by region. Ceramics in some area, metals, belts, coins, stelae in others, reflecting diverse meanings and social roles. There are also issues of both dating and preservation. There is every reason to believe that these marks were often used on organic materials like textiles, which have rarely been preserved. The image that you see here, which is from a 4th, 3rd century BC site in Khwarezmia, shows what we believe was another key use, or maybe the core, the original use of these symbols, which was as brands on animals. A similar motif of Tamgas placed on animal shoulders appears in metalwork from the Black Sea all the way to Mongolia. And finally, in a long pattern of continued use, this practice of putting Tamgas on stone continues in the post-classical period among later generations of steppic people. And it presents a real challenge for untangling when the various Tamgas are being used. Despite all of these challenges, Tamgas offer a rare window into how identity and authority move across the steppe world and into neighboring zones. By taking them seriously in all of their variation and their ambiguity, we can begin to imagine connections that speak to us otherwise only in whispers. So I'm now going to present the range of evidence for Tamga Nishan figures broadly conceived in the Arsacid world, with a little bit of a preface about the appearance of the symbols in the Achaemenid period, and also some references to practices in the Sasanian Empire where they kind of take off. Predating the Arsacid period, there is some evidence for the use of identity marking symbols that may have had connections to Tamgas, and one has to be really careful with these, in Persian contexts, particularly Persian context from Anatolia. There are a wide range of seals from Anatolia under Persian control that bear marks that seem to fit convincingly within the Tamga tradition. These are particularly known from a group of pyramidal seals examined by Boardman in the 1970s and then again in the late 90s. Keeping in mind how widespread the Tamga phenomenon becomes in the Black Sea, of which Anatolia is a part, in the immediately subsequent period, it's hard not to want to connect this to the general idea of the practice. Even more telling is a signet ring from this general period that shows a lion bearing what seems to be a tamga on exactly this place where you brand a horse, right? This is the same position as we just saw on the central steppe example. And it's a shape that's well attested. This tamga that's on this lion is a shape that's well attested in North Black Sea tamga assemblages. Another place where we see symbols that have credible associations with Tamgas as we know them from the steppe is on Achaemenid satrapal coinage. The Tamga-like signs show up on a range of satrapal issues, with these examples being just a few of them, where the examples seem to be functioning almost as monograms and are often argued to have been monograms. And this is one of the interesting things about Tamgas that we'll see when we look at Sasanian seals. There's a blurriness because they sometimes do become readable monograms. And one can argue that that part of what's being played with here is the difference between, or is a game with written language and other types of sign communication. So I'll come back to this question of Tamga monogram associations in a moment, but for the present, it's sufficient to briefly note that there is also a great deal of debate about how monograms appear on Greek coinage in the first place and what exactly they're doing. And these Tamgas are showing up at roughly the same time. So they might really be serving a similar function, which is certifying some type of validity of the coinage, despite the fact that these two ways of constructing signs are rooted in different cultural systems. There are also a lot of countermarks on Achaemenid coins that look Tamga-ish, but that is a topic that deserves much more attention than I can give it today. That said, we have to be careful not to too quickly lump all linear symbols into the Tamga category. There are, for example, a fairly large collection of both masons' marks and sculptors' marks from sites in the Achaemenid heartland, where they appear on both structural and decorative stonework from, for example, Persepolis and Pasargadae. Studies of the placement of these stamps has been convincingly tied to construction practices at the various work teams who accomplished the labor at the sites, rather than being an intrinsic marker of identity or ownership. Although, of course, there's, again, here a little bit of blurriness. The data that we have from both the seals and the satrapal coinage demonstrates, however, that at least in the context of Achaemenid Anatolia, there was some baseline familiarity with the idea of Tamga Nishan in a sense that is broadly congruent with their use in the North Black Sea and Central Asia, and the presence of some specific signs that can be identified elsewhere in the sign corpus. So already in the Achaemenid period, parts of what become the Parthian world or the broader Iranian world are already participants in this idea of marking identity and expressing authority through these symbols. In terms of Arsacid evidence for Tamgas, I'm actually going to start at the end of the story and look at a relief from the very early Sasanian period, which will then help us back interpret the earlier material. And we'll then look briefly at coins, both Arsacid dynastic and from some of the territories around and arguably under control of the Arsacids, and then Arsacid glyptic and scattered other evidence from Arsacid space. So this is the Firuzabad relief, which shows the victory of the first Sasanian king, Ardashir I, over Artaban IV, the last of the Arsacid dynasty. You will note that there are 4 horses. You can see this better in the drawn line image below, each of which is covered in repeating images, which have tended to be called emblems or devices in Sasanian studies. Schmidt published a catalog of all of these emblems known from Sasanian reliefs already in 1970. So these have shown up in the literature for a long time. Dan Potts has published on these too. The tamgas show up sporadically in Sasanian imperial art, including on reliefs, on seals, and sometimes on coins. This is one of the marks from the Firuzabad relief and its instantiation on 2 different Sasanian coins. As Potts has pointed out, it's difficult to understand the precise link that these tamgas have to specific dynastic family lines, but we see them showing up in imperial contexts that are marking authority again and again and again in Sasanian space. And we have to think back here to this idea of how ideas travel in segmented hierarchical worlds. They don't always have to have the exact same use value. But I want to take a moment to focus on this symbol, which is really hard to see in the drawing, but we've already seen it on one of the Achaemenid period satrapal coinage. It's a circle on a little stand. If we look back, and this is on the horse of Artaban IV, the horse of the last of the Arsacid dynasts, who's being killed by his Sasanian overthrower. If we go and we look at Arsacid coinage, we find exactly this symbol, and we find it coming up periodically throughout the history of Arsacid coinage. It shows up both as sort of a quasi-monogram and sometimes as just the reverse image on the coin. The fact that it's sporadic has led scholars who have looked at these coins to believe that this is something that shows up when monarchs are trying to reassert their power somehow, that it's a mark of validity of certain issues, which is certainly plausible, but doesn't exactly fully deal with how the sign symbol might also be being used in other parts of Arsacid imperial behavior that we don't see. If we look to the fringes of the Arsacid world, from these vassal territory, from the territories to the east and to the extreme west, we see an identical use of tamgas on coinage, showing up as some type of a dynastic marker, dynastic identity marker. We get this from all over the eastern space. We also get it from the Bosphorian kingdom. And interestingly, we also get it from the southern fringe of the Arsacid world, from vassal territories like Elamice and Persis, where there's a cluster of tamga-like images that show up on coinage, particularly beginning in the late 1st century BC and onwards. They are used similarly to on the Arsacid coinages themselves as either monograms on the obverse or as emblems on the reverse. The symbol that you're looking at in the coin, the Elamice coin, is often called an anchor, and it shows up on Elamite coins throughout this really, really broad period. The example on the bottom is a coin from Persis, which is from the late 1st century BCE. This provides a particularly tamga-looking tamga on the obverse. So to briefly summarize, although the tamga nishan tradition is never dominant in Arsacid coinage, it doesn't show up on all of them. It is quite clearly one part of the wider vocabulary that is being drawn on by specific communities inside of the Arsacid world and by specific Arsacid rulers in displaying their symbols of authority. As we saw with the Achaemenid example, it appears that in at least some parts of the Achaemenid world, tamga-like linear devices are being used on seals from an early period. If we fast forward again and look at the Sasanian period, we find this incredibly rich landscape of these use of tamga-like signs in glyptic. These have long been studied under the framework of devices or monograms. Some of them are readable. They have readable Pahlavi inscriptions on them. And this has been understood as a sort of extension of the original linear device into kind of a word puzzle, where the original device is then turned into something that also can convey it's a game with linguistic meaning. Our central question then is whether the Arsacid period can help us connect the limited practice of glyptic use of tamga nishan in the Achaemenid period through the explosion in the Sasanian period. Here, however, we suffer from a pretty serious problem with data sets. Glyptic in the Arsacid world remains critically understudied. There are only a few corpora known, and none have been published in a comprehensive way or in a way that is accessible, comprehensive, and provides illustrations. We do nevertheless find some limited evidence for possible tamga-like glyptic at the dynastic ritual site of Nisa in modern Turkmenistan. This is the work of Manacero, who has identified a series of seal impressions that he calls Tomga-like and that are utterly unlike the rest of the glyptic in the assemblage. I can say very superficially that we also have this on the other side of the Caspian Sea. There's a series of very, very abstracted seals, or seal impressions that we get that are totally disconnected from the rest of the glyptic corpus. But in both cases, the bullae are in very bad conditions. It's hard to read these. And it's hard to connect them in a direct way to the Tomga tradition. We do, however, get these appearance of linear devices on ceramics from across the world in the Parthian period. These are from Helmand. There are also ones from Alborz, from central Iran. There is also evidence for the use, the introduction perhaps, or continued use of Tomgas to mark silver. So the cup you see is from a steppic context. The plate with the Tomgas on the base is from the South Caucasus, which is not part of the steppe world proper and was very closely aligned with the Arsacid dynastic family at the period that this plate was made. And outside of coins and glyptic and the marks on, as identity markers on silver, we have some use for the co-occurrence of Tomgas and script across the Pontic and into the Iranian space. This is something that we know from the Pontic world very clearly, where they will put Tomgas above an inscription. We also find them carved into inscriptions from the South Caucasus, where they show up either above, on a line above or below Greek or Armazian inscriptions from the northern South Caucasus. So these records are very partial. The traces, however, point to a deeper pattern, to the persistence of Tomga-based marking systems across materials and across regions. This reinforces the idea that symbolic practices associated with the steppe continued to shape local expressions of power and belonging well into the Arsacid period. And so, by way of conclusion, I return to the question that I began with. Were the Arsacids nomads? By now, I hope it's clear that this is just fundamentally, and this is what we were talking about yesterday, the wrong question. Or at least it's not a very useful one. It reduces a complex, shifting social world into a binary, and it reflects the assumptions rooted in this sedentary view of history that privileges fixed boundaries and centralized power and clear lines of descent. The Arsacid world and the steppe worlds around it help us to see how things could have worked according to different logics. Segmentation, multiple centers of power, and lateral connections, they give us a better vocabulary for thinking about how these spaces were organized and how ideas, symbols, and authority moved within them. This symbol vocabulary, the Tomga-Nisha phenomenon, is one example of that. The signs circulated across space and across media. They appear on coins, on seals, on silver, on stone, probably on leather. They weren't always used the same way, and they didn't always mean exactly the same thing, but they point to a shared symbolic language, rooted in a practice that had its origins in the steppic societies and that continued to resonate within the Arsacid world. This challenges how we interpret empires, right? How we think about what matters in political authority. We have to think about intersecting systems of meaning, and we have to critique the sedentary assumptions that shape our history writing. So the Arsacids weren't nomads in any simple sense, but they came from and they remained connected to a world where mobility and where hierarchy played central roles. And if we take seriously the literal marks that they left behind, the ones that we often don't look at, we begin to see a different kind of historical landscape. It is messier, it is more entangled, and it is ultimately more accurate to the world that these communities actually inhabited. Thank you. Hi, Søren.
Thank you very much, Lara. Very interesting. I think one of the problems talking about the Arsacid dynasty is that we're dealing here with close to 500 years of history, of course. So very, very long period of time. And I think it's clear that at the beginning of that spectrum, the Arsacid polity, the Arsacid dynasty and dynastic identities were not the same as they were at the end. So I wanted to invite you just to reflect on where are the differences here, in particular with regard to the usage of tamgas?
Yeah, so the coinage from the south of these vassal territories is actually a really interesting part of the story, because one of the current ways of thinking about how Arsacids history develops is that it's essentially a network of these ruling families that are kind of always in tension with one another. And our historical records have flattened a lot of that into sort of a linear dynastic history, but you can actually see, and this is, I mean, Ulbrich has done some of this work, and my colleague at UCLA, Rahim Shagan, has done some of this work as well. You can see this like power play between different families. And some of those families are families that are more connected, especially to the Indo-Parthian world, and sort of to the Eastern Arsacid world. And that is one space where I think we actually see a very fully developed version of this Tamga system functioning across multiple domains. And so I think, for example, that we see some of this coming back into the Arsacid dynasty proper through these channels that are basically about which families are in control at what periods, and how much those family systems are reliant on this symbolic vocabulary. The problem here is that the historical evidence for how those internal family systems are working and when the moments of transition are is incredibly thin. So I am not sure whether we're going to be able to get to the point right now where you can connect specific moments of this to that structural system. But I think that the idea that we have to then go and search for those things, right? We have to go and search for the moments where we see maybe different ways of expressing power inside of the Arsacid space as being a product of these different family configurations. I think that's actually a very promising direction.
Thanks, that was really interesting. And one of the things I was struck by is the like really rich visual iconography, like vocabulary of symbols that you were showing. And maybe I'm sort of or over-interpreting some of them, but I was wondering, one of the things that struck me is that some of them really reminded me of like horse bits or bridle tack. And I wonder if you think there's any kind of like metonym for the kind of mobility and animal relations that you were talking about.
Yeah, I haven't really thought about to be honest, I haven't thought deeply about what they mean, like what the underlying meaning of them is. The problem with this is obviously that like little circles and little lines can mean lots of different things. And if you look at enough of them, you start to like make patterns in your head and see patterns that might not really be there, which is the risk of this. But the problem is that like the flip side risk is that you don't pay attention to these things and that you then imagine that this whole substratum just doesn't exist when like it demonstrably does. So I think certainly where you would go if you wanted to look at this question more, but it doesn't necessarily have bearing on this period, is into the later periods where we have a much more developed Tamga. And there's like a whole nother sub-story about this, that, you know, like that symbol that we've all been seeing in recent years because of the Ukraine-Russia war, right? The emblem of Ukraine also has a somewhat folk etymological, but also like kind of potentially real Tamga-ish heritage. So these take on like this wild, different course in later history, and Tamgas also become part of the way that your Eastern European cultures connect themselves back to the steppe. So like the Polish, there are like a bunch of Polish Tamgas that show up in the medieval period as heraldry, essentially. So you could probably look at periods where we have a little bit more context for them and try and pull apart whether at least in other periods they're being used this way. But I think you said 2 questions because I ran over, so I had the wrong slides. Thank you all so much.
Please stick around for lunch so that you can ask more questions of Dr. Fabian. So our next speaker is Abidemi Babatunde Babalola. Is a research archaeologist in the Department of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, the British Museum, at the British Museum, and the lead archaeologist on the MOA BM Archaeology Project, Benin City, Nigeria. He is an anthropological archaeologist whose research sits at the intersection of the archaeology of pyrotechnologies, invention, and emergence of social complexity in pre-modern West Africa. His research on the archaeology of glass has explored the stories of creativity, resilience, specialization, experimentation, survival, political economy, indigenous knowledge systems, science, and techno-identity in pre-colonial West African past. He has won multiple major archaeological awards and has published in several academic journals, including African Archaeological Review, Journal of Black Studies, Journal of Archaeological Science, International Journal of African Historical Studies, and he contributed to the award-winning book Caravans of Gold, Fragments in Time, Art, Culture, and Exchange Across Medieval Saharan Africa. So today we're conceptualizing technological inventions in Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Abidemi.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, John, for inviting me to the conference. And I want to thank everybody also for coming. So today I will be reflecting on how technology and invention among ancient early society in Sub-Saharan Africa has been conceived and discussed by scholars. So while numerous scholars crossing disciplinary boundaries have discussed issues on technological inventions, including its historiography, development, impact, various forms, environmental and socio-cultural dynamics, its biological and social dimension among humans, and its material appearance among ancient communities, Sub-Saharan Africa appears to continue to remain on the lowest rung, in this scholarship. Despite this, the growing interest in decolonizing knowledge production, technological invention is still often perceived as a rigid progression from simple to complex, confined to specific people and regions of the world. So concepts such as technology transfer diffusions, stimulus diffusions are frequently employed, uncritically in the scholarly discourses on the origins and development of sophisticated technologies in Sub-Saharan Africa. So today I will be, giving a very brief overview about what we know about technological invention and the innovations, generally, broadly speaking. And then I will talk a little bit about example of pottery, iron, and zeroing in on my work on glassmaking in Sub-Saharan Africa for the rest of this talk. So as I continue, the key questions underpinning these talks are: what is invention, and how does it, differ from innovation? And how do technological change really occur? Over decades, these questions have been at the center of anthropology, archaeology, history, Asian studies, material science, and evolutionary biology. There is no doubt that invention and innovation are often used in connection with technology to describe the degree of imaginativeness of humans. Sometimes they could connote different but substantively overlapping processes. Satilo's schematic illustration provides a very valuable visual insight into the definition and the distinction between technology and invention. It uses two case scenarios, one that separates the two and sees invention, quote, as a process of generating a novelty, end of quote, and innovation as the process of spread novelties. So the second definitional scenario creates a two process for invention, the one leading to invention and true sub-processes, and the other that emphasizes adoption and other mechanisms of spread, such as diffusion and adaptation, among others. So why these, case scenario definitions has dominated anthropological scholarship, they have been adapted in modern time to aid in understanding ancient technologies, ancient societies. Undoubtedly, these frameworks have been effective in Euro-Asian and North American context. However, as Mavunga articulated in his edited volume, what do science, technology, and innovation mean from Africa, argues that their inherently Western modernist approaches render them limited in scope, in scope when applied to African context. He goes on to argue that emphasizing how to move beyond, universalizing approaches and idea of archaeology being seen purely as science. So he also questions whose theory we use in archaeology in Africa, and how do we gauge the interaction of theory, with change in local socio-political practices. Finally, Mavunga also argued vehemently that argued for the need for a shift in technology production to include descendant community, local knowledge system, and lived experience, African epistemology, and philosophy. Having said that, it is important to note that interest in technological invention has significantly benefited from analytical studies. More importantly, recent advancements in the analytical techniques have provided remarkable opportunity for refining our understanding of invention processes from an archaeomaterialist perspective. Techniques such as isotope analysis and the laser ablation, among others, have emerged as a leading methodologies, offering nuanced insights into technological development. However, a prevailing trend in studies employing this technology, particularly in African context, heavily emphasizing tracing the origin of objects rather than the process of innovation. This approach inherently assumes a linear model of technological development, one in which invention or innovation originates from a single point and subsequently spread to other parts of the world. So why these sophisticated techniques have undoubtedly transformed how we understand and perceive, how we understand the evolution and the revolution of technology in Sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, this is exemplified by the work of Shadrach Shirikuri and Foman Bandama, on iron metallurgy in Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as recently by my work. They often, albeit subtle, overlook regional ingenuity, local invention, and adaptation. So I should also mention that another important issue in the study of ancient technological invention is the frequent analysis through an economic lens, wherein invention is defined by large-scale adoption, widespread acceptance, and economic profitability. This economic-centric ideology is rooted in the Western narrative that privileges large-scale innovation over smaller, localized development. Consequently, it biases scholarly discourses against micro-regional inventions. It is therefore not surprising that quotidian technologies at the household or community level in pre-industrial societies are often disregarded or excluded from broader discussions on technological progress. This now takes me to look into the question of why do people innovate? What are the stimuli for invention? Of course, there has been a lot of scholarship, on why and how to understand and to study the process of invention. One of the most common ideas about the understanding of technological change is the notion that technological choice is strongly connected with social and the cultural context. emphasizing the functions and roles of the composition of a thing in the society at large. The proponent of technological invention is linked to the prevailing, this type of argument is linked to prevailing sociocultural situation. The premise is that technology is socially leading, although the impact of variability in social and the cultural factor and their influence on technological choices is really not well touched on. And David Click has referred to this type of thinking as a social constructionist idea. Of course, there is a whole lot of scholarship on the connection between social processes and technological invention. There is a whole lot on that, so I don't need to go through all that. However, what I want to quickly touch on as I move on is to look at what I call the stimuli for invention, which is actually not limited to a geographical region in my home view. So following the current state of knowledge of technological invention and change, it can be summarized that necessity, trade, and environmental factors are major drivers of technological advancement among Asian society. Looking at law of literature on technological invention, this has been the common narrative that these are what stimulate invention. However, I look at this stimuli more critically and came up with understanding that there are these four things that needs to actually be present in any society for invention to really come up. One of which is the raw material. So before making anything, raw material is essential. So the essentiality of raw material is not only in its natural availability. They could be brought from somewhere else or a part of another material constituent. The underpinning factors are availability, accessibility, and exploitability. So sociocultural need or demand is also something that I think is very important. Every society has its own social and cultural valuation of objects. So no society made or used objects without meeting their social, political, economic, ritual, aesthetic, and also symbolic meaning. So it could even be for the everyday meaning or everyday activities, not necessarily has to be with ritual or symbolic meaning. So in the process of use, object also creates its own agency, and this agency of object also needs to be factored in. So the need for an object can also be one or multiple, but not necessarily for economic gain. So I also think that technological know-how is also very important in this scheme. So which means that this could be in form of inquisitiveness or industriousness to propel the know-how. It is also about capacity and ability, not necessarily having absolute expertise. It could just be someone, just being curious or having an idea in existing, form of technology. So lastly, but not the least, the presence of a charismatic leader, financier, or organizer is also important in the scheme of things. Of course, this is where someone, lead and organize, this idea and put it in a kind of formal kind of a setting. So this need not to be a political leader or elite in the character of an exploitative and gradenza, as Aiden, rightly argued in his article in 2011. Head of a guild or compound head could serve this role. The idea is to have someone within the community or village who can galvanize people and lead when it comes to decision-making. It is expected that the role of such a person could change through time, particularly as they are accorded more importance and as they are seen as a visionary. So it should be stated that the presence or absence of all of these, stimuli do not guarantee any positive result or translation into technological invention. Society differs, so is their composition, aspiration, cultural appreciation, among others. So the concept of imitation has been also used to explain how technological invention, how technology changes really happen and occur. So in terms of innovation, it's often linked to contact and encounter with technology, as it's automatically kind of translates to effort at imitation. So the idea that before you can make something, you need to have seen something that is similar to what you want to make before you can make it. So archaeological evidence from early Sub-Saharan African community has demonstrated that this is not always the case. I will mention a few examples as I continue. But now I will briefly look at development of or technology of ceramic, pottery, iron, and also glass to examine if they were transferred or how they developed in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I should say that I'm not arguing that all early technologies in Sub-Saharan Africa were independently developed. In fact, I cannot rule out the place of contact through socio-political and economic interactions in the formation of sophisticated cultural manifestation from mid-second millennium AD across Sub-Saharan Africa. Archaeological and historical sources have revealed the influence of an external factor in social complexity in Sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, interaction between people of the subcontinent and the outside world extended back to first millennium BC, if not beyond. I argue that how do we make material and evidence from across time and period speak for themselves in terms of understanding what they represent and in terms of representing people's lived experience. Low-fired ethnic pottery required, between 600 and 1,000 degrees Celsius, to get to that point of consistency. The evidence of early pottery in human history came from China, dated to around between 20,000 and 18,000 BCE, marking the beginning of agriculture in Far East. By the 14,000 BCE, pottery occurred contemporaneously in Eurasia and also in Japan. On the African continent, on the other hand, the earliest evidence of pottery came from Mali in West Africa, dated to 11,400 BCE, predating the evidence from even ancient Egypt and the Sudan and the entirety of North Africa. But the question is, why are we not talking about the connection between the ceramic, production in Mali with that in China and also Japan and also, another part of the world? We don't really get to talk much about that, but when it comes to other type of technology, then we are very quick to jump into connection and technology transfer. So the invention of iron was revolutionary globally, which brought about significant change to almost all aspects of human society. However, unlike pottery, the technology and the spread of iron remain controversial, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. The first evidence of iron metallurgy came from between Sudan and Egypt, dated to about 3000 BCE. Scholars have assumed that iron technology spread from North African side into Sub-Saharan Africa. Excuse me. The Bantu expansion migration of about 4,000 years before present, which argues that which has to do with mass movement of people from West Central Africa to the other part of Sub-Saharan Africa. So that has been credited to how and why iron technology spread across Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is also a date of second millennium BCE from Nok culture in Nigeria, early first millennium BCE from Nsukka, also in Nigeria. So scholars have vehemently pushed back this notion of invention of iron from North Africa into Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, there is a lot of debate about how and why this iron technology was independently invented in Sub-Saharan Africa, But despite a lot of argument, a lot of literature, a lot of debate on this issue, it still yet remain unresolved. There is still no concrete evidence that there is connection between the development of iron technology in Sub-Saharan Africa with North Africa and also part of the world. So now I turn to glass. So among all artificially made material, glass is the youngest but most sophisticated, with alluring characteristics such as the shininess, the colorfulness, and also its transparency and translucent in nature. So glass first appeared, of course, I should also mention that when it comes to glass technology in Sub-Saharan Africa, there is a whole lot of debate about that. There is no evidence of glass technology in Sub-Saharan Africa that predates 15th century, which is the period of European contact in Sub-Saharan Africa. And also this question of externality of glass objects in West Sub-Saharan Africa is a predominant discourses that links evidence of glass into political economy and social complexity, and of course it's also connected to externality. That of course when you see glass is an external object and also evidence of political economy. And glass has also been used as a chronological marker because of this idea that it would not have been existent before 15th century. So when you see it, automatically it dates your site to 15th century, or later. And again, it's being seen as mostly, a craft, as an object and art, not really as technology that, formed part of the daily life of people of Sub-Saharan Africa. So looking very quickly at the timeline of glass in Sub-Saharan Africa. So glass first appeared in, of course, Mesopotamia and Egypt at around between 2500 and 1500 BCE. By late first millennium CE, glass technology was known in most parts of the world, the Roman world and co. But what is interesting about glass is that as the technology developed in different places, its recipe was also changing. The technology for the glass was changing. For example, the earliest glass was flux with ash of a soda-rich plant. And by 9th century BCE, source of a natural soda from Wadi Nutrum in Egypt was exploited to make neutron glass. Other types of glass were also developed in other places, including South Asia, the soda lime aluminum glass. In China, the Chinese lead barium glass was developed between 400 and 300 BCE, and the medieval European wood ash glass was also developed. So these regions have exhibited evidence of glass production, archaeologically, and the earlier historical sources have unequivocally revealed trading of glass ingots and objects, as well as a possible transfer of the object and also the technology, of course, in the Mediterranean and also the Middle East, across the world. But the question is, where was Sub-Saharan Africa in this story and this history of glass technology? What do we know about, glass technology as a material, as an object in Sub-Saharan Africa? So the earliest evidence of glass came from Nimbiri Site 3 in Mali in form of a fragmented cobalt blue bead, from archaeological context dated to between 600 and 400 BCE. Yeah, the high-like motif on the bead reminiscence the bead widely traded by the Phoenician in the first millennium BCE. Chemical composition of the glass bead identified it to have been a neutron glass manufactured in Syria, Palestine region, and also colored with Egyptian cobalt. So after that, we also see evidence of glass in form of glass bead, in particular in other early West African sites. And the map on the screen shows places across West Africa where we see evidence of glass, mostly in form of glass bead, from around 1st millennium BCE to 500 AD. In Eastern and Southern Africa, the site of Nimbiri dated to 500 BCE to 1600 CE, has yielded numerous glass beads, cullet, and a bead originated from the Middle East and also South Asia, which funneled into the region through the Indian Ocean trade. Unlike Nimbiri sites, these two sites, showed evidence of remelting of imported glass for bead making, as well as modification of imported beads to suit local taste and value. However, none of these sites, these early sites, of course, apart from none of these early sites in Sub-Saharan Africa actually demonstrate any evidence of primary glass making, which is a process whereby glass is made from its raw material, to make glass as object. So the question now is, was there any evidence of glass making in Sub-Saharan Africa, or what do we know about technology of glass in Sub-Saharan Africa? In the last decade, my research has extensively focused on investigating glass technologies in West Africa, with focus on Ile-Ife, which I will come back to, in the forest of southwestern Nigeria. Ile-Ife was emerged was an emerging power in the late 10th century CE, and by 11th century CE, it has burgeoned to be a regional center of political and ritual power. Archaeological evidence throughout Ile-Ife have yielded several thousands of glass beads associated with, glass workshop, at the sites, which I will mention shortly. However, what do we know about glass in Ife, at the period that is popularly called the classical period in Ife, which is from 11th century through 15th century? Then that takes me to the work, pioneering work of Claire Davidson, which was carried out in 1972 as part of her PhD work. And she's of the opinion, of course, she concludes that there is no evidence that any of the glass found in Ile-Ife were made from raw materials in Sub-Saharan West Africa. The glass shows, she continues, no particular idiosyncrasies which might alert one to the possibility of local manufacture. She goes on to say that there is not sufficient reason to hypothesize the existence of West African center of production from raw material, which no tangible evidence has been reported. So this is a submission in 1972 that suggests that there is nothing there. Then they would, of course, I should mention that our work was based on some of the glass objects excavated in the 50s and the 60s and 70s from Nigeria. So she did not do the excavation herself. So to fast track to the 80s and the 2000s, we have these articles, one talking about arguing for the possible glass bead making workshop in Ife, and the other one by Lactin and Co., the one on the right, which is the most significant one, that argues for the first time in 2006 for the possibility of primary glass production center, pre-15th century primary glass production center, possibly in or near Ile-Ife. That was their submission in this article. Of course, this article has a lot of criticism in terms of the choice of the materials that were analyzed, because the work was predominantly on museum collection from the British Museum. Some of the material analyzed were also bought in the local market in Ife, but none of them came from archaeological context, dated archaeological context. And that was the basis of my PhD, to try to produce archaeological context, perhaps to their argument, and to see if what this particular type of glass bead they identify with high lime aluminum actually has archaeological integrity and can be traced back to the archaeological context in Ife. And that was what my PhD was on. So now, what do we know about glass technology in Ife as I move very quickly? Over the years, I've conducted myself several archaeological excavations at the site called Igbo-Olokun in Ile-Ife, which is the same site where the German anthropologist Leo Frobenius visited in 1910. And while he was visiting, one of the community members dug up, the iconic Ife bronze edge that almost everybody knows, dug it up for him from this same site, And then, of course, he mentioned that he was borrowing, he used the word borrowing, that he was borrowing at the site, and at some around 15 feet below the ground, he came across tons of glass bead and ash and several glassy objects, which of course he connected to, be evidence of the lost Greek civilization in Sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, that is already, ancient history anyway. So, yeah, we've been doing archaeological work at the site for my PhD and thereafter, and the archaeological work has recovered tremendous amount of glass bead, crucible fragments, production debris, waste, among others. The beads are both complete and the unfinished and finished glass bead. But the interesting thing is in the chemical composition, not just in the looking, because in the looking, all beads look alike, all objects look alike. You can't tell where they are coming from, and that has been the parameter for identifying which is, where they came from initially before now. So we have conducted a number of chemical analyses on this glass bead, and we discovered that the high lime aluminum glass is the predominant group that we identified from this site. About almost 80% of the glass bead analyzed belongs to this group. Not only the 80%, the other subgroups, the other groups that we identify are also kind of subgroup of the high lime aluminum. They are not necessarily something different coming from outside. And again, to now look at why and how can we differentiate this glass from the Islamic glass, the Roman glass, the medieval European glass that we all popularly know. So looking at this image, just to, forget about what is in there, just look at the distinction between these two groups of glass. The Ife high lime aluminum glass are those in, I think, blue, and the late Bronze Age Egyptian glass and the Roman glass are those, down there. You can see that they are completely different. Comparing the rubidium and the strontium analysis in the case of this, rubidium and the potash in the case of that. So obviously from this, it shows that we are dealing with a very different type of glass. But the question is, what does that mean, in terms of where was the raw material coming from, and what are the other evidence beyond the chemical composition that suggests primary production as opposed to secondary remelting of imported glass. And one of the evidence is seen in looking at the glass on the inside of one of the, of course, a lot of crucibles, but we are lucky enough to capture this one that shows evidence of a residual quartz, still preserved in the matrix of the glass on the inside of the crucible, which suggests that raw materials were fed into the crucible rather than, feeding existing glass into the crucible to remelt those glass. And of course, there is also evidence of a mixture of colorant, in the glass, which is preserved in form of this, preels, copper preels, that shows that they were adding metallic copper into the, the glass bath. And there is also evidence of a semi-finished glass, which is a kind of a quintessential kind of evidence on archaeological sites that suggests primary glass production. So inside one of the crucible, we have this semi-finished glass that sits right in the bottom of the crucible. And semi-finished glass is a kind of a, intermediate stage of melting raw materials, and it's kind of a, semi-vitrified. It's not glass yet, and neither is it raw material completely. And they're looking at this semi-finished glass. we are able to identify different type of material constituents that form, to make this glass, and all of which actually match up with the composition of the geological components within this region in Ife, which suggests that the raw materials used in this glass were actually, exploited within the region of Ife. And of course, another level of evidence, as I begin to wrap up, is looking at this material assemblage, as what do they mean and what can they tell us in terms of the process of production. And looking at this material assemblage, I was able to identify different stages, involved in the glass bead making, right from the initial stage of collection of raw material, mixture of raw material. There is evidence of every stages of production, every step, all the way until it gets to the stage of glass bead making. And this is a kind of evidence that we don't see anywhere else, and it's about the first time we have this complete chain of operation of glass bead in Sub-Saharan Africa that predates 15th century. So we're talking about early 11th century through early 15th century at the site. So as I begin to conclude, what do we know about, how can this help us to understand Sub-Saharan African, technology and invention? And that takes me to Shadrach Shiriku's idea of pre-European African laboratory. How do we identify African laboratory from archaeological context? How do we expect African laboratory where technology was tested, experimentation was carried out to be similar to what we know from the Middle East or what we know from the Roman world? How do we, for example, there is no evidence of a primary glass production furnace in Sub-Saharan Africa, and what we found in Ife is about the first one. And how can we compare that in terms of infrastructure with the type of furnace we know from the Middle East? Do we expect, the glass making evidence, glass making furnace in the Middle East to be exactly the same thing we will see in Sub-Saharan Africa? So if we continue to go out in the field with this type of idea, there's high possibility that we miss that nuances and not be able to get that. Then Igbo Olokun has demonstrated that high lime, high aluminum glass are indigenous, innovation or invention. Of course, we can argue about the difference between innovation and invention was not widely spread, was not widely adopted, whichever way. But like I said in the introduction of my talk, that how do we pick all these smaller scale, technology, invention, and what they actually meant in the society? In the case of this glass bead, I'm not going to go into what glass bead actually, the interpretation, the meaning of glass bead within Yoruba society, even across West Africa, is a very, very important object, which, the question is, why were they not producing vessel glass? Why were they not producing glass vases? Why were they not producing plate and cups and stuff like that? Why glass beads? Why glass bead? Because that was what makes sense to them in the society. That was what was in demand in the culture at the time. Then the idea of a stimulus diffusion, technological transfer among other ancient society must be reconsidered. How, I've heard a lot of, question about, yes, it's not diffusion, but it's kind of a stimulus diffusion. So how do we explain the idea of stimulus diffusion if it's not diffusion? Is it diffusion or stimulus diffusion or not diffusion? So, so let me just read my script. So my work sits mostly within interdisciplinary boundaries. However, anthropological archaeology has the largest interest in the study of technological invention in ancient society. This is because almost every aspect of the past is indirectly or directly connected with things and the process of making. From fashioning of stone tools, to basketry, to pottery, to even, invention of irrigation system, food domestication, production, iron smelting and making, and the glass making. These are things that are of interest to archaeology, and we see that the term technology and invention continues to emerge as we look into, study ancient society. So this demonstrates that the topic on technology and invention is almost unavoidable in anthropology and archaeology, and they request critical perspective beyond conjectural, establishing connectivity among different society and how interaction evolved to become complex and how society impacts one another is of greater essence and required significant action. However, did similar technology always originate from a single point? Archaeological evidence has shown that technological development at different points of the globe, technologies develop at different parts of the globe differently. Some were contemporaneous, of course, but not necessarily connected. How do we research connectivity, without dominance of one over the other? Focus on the so-called epicenter of the particular technology undermines variability and the social, political, environmental uniqueness, as opposed to the common wisdom that Western African was, was not populated until much later. Recent paper that was published recently, on the existence of human occupation in Sub-Saharan Africa. Actually, the rainforest Africa is now dated to about 150,000 years ago. And before this evidence, it's always been the evidence from Iweliru in Nigeria, which about 12,000 years ago. So this new evidence shows that there is a lot going on under the forest of Sub-Saharan Africa that we don't know yet, and we should not assume. So as I close, finally, I will leave you with this. In the beginning scene in this movie, Moana 2, she was on the water exploring, and she was like, why are we the only one living here? It seems there are people in the other island, but we are yet to discover them. There must be people there, and she went there. While she was moving around, she found this piece of ceramic. She brought it back to her dad and was like, this is not us. There are people there, but we are yet to find them. And guess what? At the end of the movie, the people showed up on canoe like them. So which shows that the technology they had, there are other people somewhere too that had the same technology. So I will end with this, that the inquisitive but free mind makes the greatest discovery. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. You were talking about how Frobenius looks at these technologies and sees that as evidence that Europeans came to Africa. And I see a certain trend in looking at a lot of these kind of Nigerian sites that it's like, oh, look, trade goods from India. Oh, this is evidence of connectivity, which shows us how powerful these African states were, the long-distance nature, that Africa was actually connected. It wasn't isolated. And I understand the reason behind why people want to do that, but I think, as you've shown so beautifully, the problem is if you concentrate on that, you're forgetting so much of what is specific about Africa. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about your thoughts on African archaeology as a field. Are these kind of connections that the rest of us, I think, are so gleefully concentrating on, is that actually something that's good for African archaeology and its development right now? Or is that a question that should actually be put aside as the field starts to grow and develop?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I think it's a question that I've also been dealing with myself. I mean, in some of my work, I often talk about the connection too. I've organized a conference seminar on connectivity, globalization and localization, also like he demonstrated in his talk. So I mean, For me, personally, I think it's time for African archaeologists or Africanists to kind of move away a little bit. It seems African scholarship and knowledge of African is being so much reliant on what happened outside Africa. And then we are neglecting exactly what happened within the continent. And actually, Shadrach Rikuri has also, talked about this, in one of his talks, the idea of globalization within African continent itself. I mentioned glass bead as evidence of, which a lot of people have used as evidence of political economy in Africa. And they talk about, look at glass bead as exotic objects that immediately translates to power and elite, the presence of elites, people and stuff like that. But if you look at, geography a little bit, this single glass bead crossed the Indian Ocean, let's say from Iraq, Iran, somewhere in Indian Ocean, into Western Africa, covering distance 200, 300 kilometers. But we have another object, let's say iron, that traveled from Mali to Great Zimbabwe, 2,000 kilometers. It's still local. But the tiny one that just crossed the ocean, 200 kilometers, automatically it becomes something that everybody wants to look at. But nobody wants to look at the one that came all the way 2,000, 3,000 miles, within Africa. So personally, I think we've done a lot on trying to connect how Africa connects with the global world, which of course is a great thing. But I think it's high time for some scholars to actually focus also on, the variability and also what really happened, within African continent. I think with this approach, then we begin to understand so many things that we really don't understand. So that's my view on that.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I personally worked on the transmission of glass-making technology into China in the first millennium BC. And one similarity I noticed is that glass beads is also the preferred form. They also didn't make glass vessels or anything else. Why do you think glass beads, and particularly eye beads too, that was really the thing, why that form is the preferred glass form?
Yeah, thank you. And again, I will take you back to what I said in my talk, because it's kind of a, culture-specific, people-specific in terms of valuation. And next week, I'm giving a talk at Pristine titled "Not All Beads Are Equal." Because there is early European historical sources in West Africa around early 1500 that talks about exchange, on the coast of West Africa with the Europeans, and the people were lining up, with gold to exchange for European beads, and the question is, why will you give gold for beads? Why? I mean, common wisdom in contemporary time, you feel like you are crazy. You want to exchange gold for beads, but it's a question of valuation. What is important to them in the society at the time is different from what was important to the global world. So of course there might be similarity in terms of beads being something that was held in high esteem in China at the time, and also same thing in Sub-Saharan Africa, but not necessarily connected. But I think it has more to do with the local valuation, local fashion, local taste. I think in Sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically among the Yoruba people, predating glass beads, there was a lot of stone bead. Cornelian stone bead was very common, and that was a symbol of power and authority before glass beads. But at some point, someone, somehow, I don't know, I can't explain yet, found glass, and someone think that it would be nice for this glass to replace kind of stone. And the glass was given the same valuation that was accorded stone beads previously, and even more. And again, I think one of the reasons is because of the characteristics of glass. It's more shiny. It can come out in several colors that you can make by yourself, not depending on the natural color of the stone. You can decide to make it yellow. And of course, I'm not going to go into the technicality in terms of how they make the colors in Ife, for example. But one of my articles actually looks into the colorants
that were added to make that give those color. And every colorant defiled the common wisdom of colorants from elsewhere. You know, for them to make yellow, they were not adding, you expect lead and antimony stuff. No lead, zero lead, yet they have yellow color. Why and how? So it shows that technology kind of could evolve. I mean, not from nothing. Definitely, maybe there is element of something, but that something is not necessarily something from outside, as we all, you know, most of the time think about. Can we take one more or later? Okay.
I just want us to stay more or less in time, but please stay and ask more questions as you're enjoying the lunch. Another round of applause for all of our speakers.